Okay, thank you very much. That was a excellent teeing me off for this talk about training the brain and specifically in clinically anxious preschoolers. Um, so I want to give a brief disclaimer before I jump in that this is actually a very low-tech cognitive training strategy that I'm going to tell you about today, but it certainly could be considered proof of um, sort of pilot work or proof of concept that cognitive training may be helpful in young people who maybe a bit more neuroplastic to help with anxiety. Next slide, please. So just to kind of set the stage, I want to sort of do a little psychoeducation, if you will, that anxiety problems actually start very early. It's surprising, but as young as preschool age, here you can see 3 years of age, as many as 20% of children will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. And while this doesn't necessarily sort of set a life stage, you're going to have anxiety forever, it's going to go on to other bad things, depression, substance use, and so on, it certainly does increase risk for those problems. Early anxiety can be a harbinger of more psychopathology later in life. Really underscoring the point that if we can intervene early to help young children who are anxious, we may be able to shape brain development and prevent a host of psychopathology and other problems later in life. Next slide. So also kind of framing this a little bit, what do we have now that we can use to help youngsters who are clinically anxious? Well, our evidence-based treatment that is most commonly used in young children is cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. And this particular study is a multi-center trial that examined anxiety in slightly older youth. But you can see here that while cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, worked well, 40% of the kids in the study just didn't respond. And I can tell you that the rates of non-response are even a little bit higher in youngsters, that is preschoolers who are clinically anxious. So this kind of sets the stage for, we want to intervene early, we have reason to intervene early, we've got a tool, but hey, could that tool be made better? We'd like to get more kids well. Next slide, please. So this is kind of one of the parts I was thinking Sandeep set up so beautifully for. Just as we know from neuroscience in adulthood, there's evidence to suggest that these neural networks that are implicated in psychopathology are formed from very young ages. And the basic premise of how could we use cognitive training to help a child overcome anxiety is the notion that it may be excessive sensitivity or reactivity of amygdala to threat that drives anxiety from young ages. And that amygdala and this sort of sensitivity to threat may develop earlier than more cortical, sort of more sophisticated systems in the brain that underpin cognitive control. So in theory, if we were able to boost cognitive control, that is train these cortical systems to implement cognitive control, it may help children overcome fear. Next slide. So this is getting a little bit more into the role of cognitive control and how that might be relevant for anxiety or for a closely related problem, obsessive compulsive disorder. And you can see even in the way that cognitive behavior therapy works, cognitive control is needed. So if you think about, what is CBT? It's basically exposing a child, or an adult for that matter, who is anxious to a fear trigger over and over and over again until the fear kind of comes down on its own. And that person learns that, this threat isn't so threatening after all. But to be able to engage in that process, you really need to be able to feel the fear and do it anyways. That do it anyways is cognitive control, the ability to kind of shift, set, and instead of running away and avoiding the threatening stimulus, try to engage with it and inhibit, as well as response inhibition, that desire to avoid. Next slide. So in thinking about training the brain, how are we going to index this cognitive control in little kids? What is our brain target, if you will? And so the target that we've chosen in our lab is an EEG-based neural index of cognitive control called the error-related negativity. And what's interesting about the error-related negativity is in adults with anxiety and OCD, it's actually been found to be increased too much, too high, and has been interpreted as maybe a hypersensitivity to threat. But you could also see it alternatively, that the error-related negativity is indexing this part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, to detect a mistake so that you can go on and adjust your behavior and perform correctly the next time. So if you think about this, it may be that patients with anxiety are able to detect anxious thoughts as thinking errors. It doesn't make sense. It's too much. I should go on and go in instead of avoid. And if you think in this manner, it's possible that this increased activity of the anterior cingulate cortex to errors, as indexed by the ERN, could be a compensatory phenomena in anxiety or OCD. Next slide. And in fact, what we have been learning about the relationship between this error-related negativity index of cognitive control with anxiety in young children is the relationship is actually reversed. So in other words, the younger you are, the more anxious you are, the smaller your ERN. So kind of consistent potentially with that idea that perhaps in early childhood, when these cortical structures for detecting errors and adjusting behavior, what we know is cognitive control, are less developed, it may set the stage for anxiety symptoms to emerge, consistent with that kind of imbalance slide I was showing you before of too much threat reactivity, perhaps mediated by the amygdala, relative to too little cortical functioning for cognitive control. Next slide. So what we're trying to do in a cognitive training study where we use, like I said, low tech, it's a play-based cognitive training, is to shift what we hypothesize is that imbalance. Too much reactivity to fear, too little capacity for cognitive control, or abbreviated here, effortful control, which I'm kind of using synonymously. So what does this training consist of? It's pretty simple, actually. We use a series of games that were actually developed by Jeff Halperin for training the brain and increasing cognitive control in ADHD. We were kind of downward extending to a younger age group who happened to be anxious rather than suffering ADHD. And the games include things that, we all know and love, or our kids know and love, such as red light, green light, where you have to inhibit a response. Simon Says, the working memory game. Basically, the games are all tailored to just be a hammer to increase the subcomponent functions that we know of broadly as cognitive control, whether those be response inhibition, cognitive interference, working memory, selective attention, and so on. In addition, as we treat the kids with these games, which are delivered over the course of 3-hour sessions spread over approximately a month, so 5 of these sessions. But as we deliver these games, the games get harder and harder and harder. We've kind of changed the rules on the kids so that they do make mistakes. And in that context, we teach them something that Phil Zalazzo developed called reflection training, which is the ability to sort of think yourself through a mistake and talk yourself into, well, how would I adjust my behavior to perform more correctly next time? Next slide, please. So this is just a pilot study that at this point, we recently were funded to do a much larger controlled trial where we're using this effortful control or cognitive control training compared to an active comparator, which is a play group control. But what I'm going to be presenting to you now is just an open label results from our pilot study of the cognitive control training. And you can see here that the kids that we studied were ranging in age from approximately 4 to 7, slightly more girls than boys. The anxiety was, some of it was clinically significant, but we dipped down into some subclinical as measured by the Spence preschool anxiety scale. And there was also some ADHD. We didn't exclude that. So we ended up controlling for that in our analyses. And what I'm showing you here is both completers and non-completers. It's not easy to get little kids to like do an EEG and actually give you the data, even if they're, especially if they're anxious. But I wanted to mention that while we did have this chunk of non-completers, they were really no different in terms of anxiety level or ADHD symptoms or really gender. But where they did vary was young age. They were maybe a trend here you see towards slightly younger. Next slide. So what happened? What happened after we delivered these play-based cognitive training exercises to kids? It was like a camp-like format. We had groups of maybe 4 to 6 clinically anxious preschoolers. And what happened was, at least hopefully if this pans out relative to the active comparator, but what we saw in the pilot open label study is we did drive that error-related negativity up. So that was our brain index, if you will, of cognitive control. In addition, we drove up some behavioral markers of cognitive control. HTKS stands for head, toes, knees, and shoulders. And you tell the kid, touch your toes, and really the rule is you actually touch your head. So it is kind of a response inhibition task, as well as dinky toys, which is another inhibitory control task. So in driving the ERN up, we also saw increased behavioral indices, improvement on behavioral tasks for cognitive control, and decreased anxiety in this pilot sample. Next slide. So where next? I mean, I think, I already mentioned to you the double, not really double blind, but the controlled trial with the active comparator. But I think that this is proof of concept that we can measure the brain, we can measure behavior from pre to post a cognitive training. And certainly if we want to be able to disseminate most broadly, it would be really useful if we could get an app, such as a cognitive training app, that you wouldn't have to have so many camp counselors, for example, to treat the kids. So with that, I want to turn it over to the next speaker, and thank you for your attention.